Cyan gave Popper a strong kick, causing his body to hit the wall. While Popper was lying on the ground with his body leaning against the wall, Cyan turned towards Krantz, put both hands in his pockets, and while staring into his eyes, asked if they could have a little chat. Upon seeing that Popper had been defeated, Krantz started to panic. He turned towards Cyan and with a trembling voice asked what he was talking about. Upon hearing this, Cyan approached Krantz and placed a hand on his shoulder. At that moment, Krantz's expression changed drastically. While looking at Cyan, he couldn't help but cry and sweat at the same time because he knew something bad was going to happen. While Cyan had his hand on Krantz's shoulder, he leaned his head towards him and while staring at him with a murderous look, he started to smile and explained that he didn't care what Krantz did behind his back because in the end, he was a tolerant person. After saying this, Cyan began to move away from Krantz. Then he opened his mouth and with a smile warned Krantz that if he caused him any more problems, then he would graduate in a wheelchair. Upon hearing this, Krantz began to feel immense terror. He lifted his head and as tears were falling from his eyes, he started to feel immense pressure. Due to the immense pressure that Cyan's words had created, Krantz fell to his knees on the ground next to Popper's body, and while he had both hands and knees supported on the floor, he began to look down and thought that he had messed with the wrong person. As Cyan slowly moved away from Krantz and Popper, he started looking down at the ground and couldn't help but smile. He thought to himself that in the future, academic life was going to be fun. Several hours later, it became dusk, and as sunlight streamed into the library through the windows, someone who had climbed up to the second floor of the library using a ladder came back down. This person was none other than Instructor Serika. She went down to the first floor using the ladder and slowly began walking towards the other shelf. She brought her hand close to her face, and while touching her glasses, she thought about the words that the dean had told her. He had mentioned how Cyan could either cause a disaster or be a hero. In order to prevent anything bad from happening, she decided to keep a close eye on Cyan. Several minutes later, she reached a shelf and stood still for several seconds, creating tension in the atmosphere. She reached out her hand towards the shelf to grab the book. In doing so, she realized that a book was missing. While staring at the empty space where the book should have been, she began to wonder where it was. At that moment, Cyan caught her attention. He was leaning on the shelf and had the missing book in his hand. He placed his other hand on top of his arm, turned his head towards her, and while staring at her intently, he began to smile and asked if she was looking for this book. Upon hearing Cyan's voice, Serika's expression changed drastically. While still looking at the shelf, she became shocked and alert at the same time. She started wondering what was happening. To not appear suspicious, she quickly turned her head towards Cyan, closed her eyes, put her hand behind her head and with a smile asked him how a student had entered this place. She also added that students were not allowed here. Inside, she began to wonder why she hadn't been able to sense Cyan's presence. She started approaching him, pointed at him with her finger and asked him if his name was Cyan. She also asked him if he could return the book to her since it contained data that she needed for her research. While Cyan was leaning on the shelf, he put his hand in his pants pocket and while holding the book with the other hand, he started staring at Serika and simply remained silent for several seconds. He lifted his head and while looking at Serika, he asked her if she was talking about the book. Then with a smile he replied that of course. Cyan handed a card to Instructor Serika and as she reached out to take it, she thanked him. While Cyan had his guard down, Serika launched an attack at him, causing a sharp energy to slowly approach his face. Upon noticing the presence of the attack, he was surprised and began to wonder what was happening. In the blink of an eye, Cyan dodged the attack, causing Serika's attack to cut in half the book she herself was searching for. As the pages of the book were falling slowly to the ground and the evil aura was disappearing, Cyan assumed an offensive stance. While staring into Serika's eyes, he asked her if this wasn't what she was looking for. After saying this, Cyan first called Serika, the instructor of the academy, and then asked her if she was not Lady Serika Nigrathi from the Mist Assassins organization. While one of Serika's hands emitted an evil aura, she began to hold the card that Cyan had given her with the other hand. As the pages of the book slowly fell to the ground, she stared at Cyan with a murderous look and asked who he was and how he had discovered this. In his past life, Cyan had thought that his first impression of Instructor Serika was very ordinary. One day, like any other, Cyan went to Serika's office. She closed her eyes and with a smile, she asked him how life was going for him at the academy. Cyan had his face full of scratches. He started looking down with a lost gaze and simply remained silent for several seconds. While Serika had one hand resting on the table, with the other she began touching her glasses. While staring directly at Cyan, she started smiling and told him that despite his desire to end this boring counseling session, it was necessary for the student's growth. Cyan began to wonder if she expected growth from him, someone who was always being harassed by his own brother. While Cyan was looking down with a lost look, he decided it wasn't worth it. He replied to her that he didn't care. For Cyan, her words had sounded like a joke. While he was immersed in his thoughts, Serika caught his attention and told him that she was very interested in him. Upon hearing this, Cyan's expression drastically changed. Suddenly, he felt a bit happy and gradually stopped looking at the ground, starting to lift his head. Serika leaned an arm on the table and while staring directly at Cyan, she explained that it was rare to see someone with an 84% in the dark element. While Cyan had both hands resting on his knees, he began to look at Serika and explained that he had been told that the dark element was not a special element. While Serika had one hand under her breasts, she supported the other on the table, and while pointing to the side with her finger, with a pleasant smile she explained to Cyan that humanity didn't know much about it. She also added that she actually believed his growth potential was infinite. Upon hearing Serika's words, Cyan was surprised and felt overwhelmed by confusion. As sunlight streamed through the window, she closed her eyes and smiled as she told Cyan that she looked forward to working with him. Cyan thought that this person might be able to help him. While he was staring at Serika, he adopted an offensive stance. In his past life, he had misunderstood her words and didn't actually know that he was being deceived. While little by little the pages of the book were falling to the ground, and Serika's hand was emanating a dark aura, she placed her other hand on her waist and simply started looking down at the floor in silence. Cyan decided not to fall for that innocent face again. Being an instructor here was just a cover job for her. In reality, she was an assassin. Serika took off her glasses with one hand and with a killer look, she began to stare at Cyan. At that moment, he realized that she was the master of the hall in the assassin's organization. Mist. She was hiding in the academy where all the royals and nobles of the continent came to learn. While Serika was holding the glasses in her hand, she told Cyan that she had already had enough. Upon hearing this, he became somewhat confused. Slowly, Serika began to turn around. While she was staring at Cyan intently, she gave him the order to clean up this mess. She also asked him to come with her to her laboratory, where she would listen to him. Upon hearing this, Cyan became confused. While he was watching Serika walk away, he thought that she hadn't actually reacted as dramatically as he had expected. Several minutes later, Cyan went to Serika's laboratory. This place was filled with the most advanced tools of the time. Upon entering the laboratory, Cyan thought that this place hadn't changed. Cyan sat next to Serika and picked up the teacup. Slowly, he began to bring it closer to his mouth. While holding the teacup with one hand and the plate with the other, he lifted his head, closed his eyes, and with a smile told her that he knew she had put poison in the tea. He knew things were going too well. While Serika was holding the teacup with one hand, she closed her eyes and started laughing. She asked Cyan not to worry about the poison since it wasn't very severe. She also added that this particular poison would only melt his organs. Cyan lowered his head, closed his eyes, and began to smile. He thought to himself that this poison wouldn't work on him since he was someone who had consumed countless demonic beast blood and Emily's food. After thinking about this, Cyan raised his head and, while staring into Serika's eyes with a murderous look, advised her to use a stronger poison next time. Upon hearing this, Serika started staring at Cyan with a murderous look and asked if they should talk. While she was bringing the teacup to her mouth, she started staring at Cyan and asked him how he knew who she was. Upon hearing this, Cyan placed the teacup on the saucer and slowly began to withdraw his hand. Serika also asked him how he knew that she received orders from that specific and unpopular book in the library. She also asked him how he knew the exact location of the book. As she pondered this, she put her hand under her chin and while staring intently at Cyan, she asked him if he was also part of Mist. Cyan began to look at Serika with a conceited gaze and simply asked her what more proof she needed. While Serika's body was emanating an evil energy, she started staring at Cyan with a murderous look and began to smile. She asked him if he had a big head for his elemental test. Cyan turned his head to the side and explained to Serika that before leaving for Chatran, everyone had asked him if only one night escort and a coachman would be enough. Upon hearing this, Serika became somewhat confused and began to wonder what he was talking about. Cyan explained to her that everyone had asked him this because nobles had been killed left and right recently. Cyan started staring at Serika with a murderous look and asked her when the purification project would begin. Upon hearing this, Serika started looking down at the ground and asked him what purification project he was talking about. At that moment, Serika's body began to emit a dark aura, and while she was staring at Cyan with a murderous look, she told him that she wasn't very sure about what he was talking about. Cyan stood up, and while adjusting his tie with one hand, his body started emanating a powerful aura. He stared at Serika with a murderous look and explained that he was referring to the assassinations. Upon hearing this, Serika started smiling and told Cyan that he might regret what he just said. As Cyan's eyes were gleaming, he also smiled and asked Serika if she was threatening a student. Serika forcefully hit the table with her foot, causing it to gradually tilt towards Cyan and fall on top of him. Upon seeing this, Cyan assumed a defensive stance. He clenched his fist to strike the table and asked Serika with a serious look if that was how she was going to respond. Cyan forcefully struck the table, causing it to split in half. Seizing this moment, Serika took a big leap. While in midair, she unsheathed both daggers and prepared to attack while staring intensely at Cyan. While the pieces of wood from the table were slowly falling to the floor, Cyan slightly turned his head to one side, and while looking at Serika, he explained that he had thought he had already proven his identity enough. She gained momentum, and as she was slowly advancing towards Cyan, she began to smile and told him that even if Cyan really was part of Mist, there couldn't be a member she didn't have knowledge of since, after all, she was the Hall Master. She attacked Cyan using both daggers, but he quickly moved aside and dodged the attack. Seeing this, Serika regained momentum, and while her daggers emitted a powerful evil aura, she stared fixedly at Cyan and with a smile told him that she wasn't going to let him go. While Cyan was watching as Serika approached him, he told her that he had no other choice anymore, so he extended his hand to the side, causing the Karam sword to appear in his hand. Cyan attacked Serika, but luckily she was able to block the attack in time using both daggers. Cyan gained momentum, and while advancing quickly towards Serika, he explained to her that if she couldn't believe him, then he would show it to her. In the blink of an eye, Cyan launched powerful slashes towards Serika. Seeing the speed at which he was attacking, she clenched her teeth tightly and was surprised. Cyan attacked Serika again, causing her body to be thrown backwards. At that moment, she began to stare fixedly at Cyan's dagger and couldn't help but feel fear, as she realized that it was the demonic sword Karam, which only the Chosen One by Eru could wield. While Cyan held the dagger with one hand and while it emitted a powerful energy, he turned his head towards Serika. While staring into her eyes, he asked if she now believed him. He also added that he supposed Mist was currently searching for the successor. Upon hearing this, Serika was surprised. She put away the daggers, and while looking at Cyan with a surprised expression, she asked him how he knew this. Cyan approached her, leaning the dagger on his shoulder and putting his other hand in his pocket. While staring into her eyes, he replied that the person she had been searching for was right in front of her. After saying this, he asked her to take him to Eru. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.